The weight regain and rehydration between the weigh-in and the actual competition actually offset a lot of the muscle function losses. As Caucasian as I can get, and I am pretty much allergic to seasoning. And most of you have actually probably experienced this. I'm willing to bet that if you've gone out to drink with your buddies, if you're gonna cut, you need to cut hard. It's called acute weight loss for a reason. So the only thing that was manipulated was the water loading in the first 3 days. Then you go, you weigh in the next day, make weight, and then as soon as you start drinking water and introducing the electrolytes back into your system, it sticks and you absolutely... All right guys, welcome to the third and final video in the series that I'm doing on weight cutting in the combat sports, specifically for grapplers and fighters. I'm Patrick Jacobs. I'm a physical therapist. I see patients daily. I have a doctor of physical therapy, and more importantly, I have a doctor of brolosophy. Probably going to keep mentioning that in almost every video I do from now on because I'm very proud of it. So you probably haven't heard the last of it, I'm sorry to say. But today we're going to talk about the advanced concepts in weight cutting, and we're mainly going to gear that towards water loading, okay, or water cutting as it's known colloquially. So let's go ahead and get to the agenda. Macronutrients is probably something that you guys already understand. Most of you already understand, but this is an educational channel for the everyday combat athlete or folks that want to be competitive with it. So I want to make sure that we're covering our bases there. We're going to talk about meal timing, muscle retention, hunger mitigation, and then we'll get to the really big guy. We'll talk about water loading and electrolyte manipulation. Marcus Aurelius, that part is for you. All right, we're going to look at some studies that help guide me whenever I give advice to folks to hop on a Zoom call with me to talk about their competition preps, fighting preps, things like that. And then we'll actually give an example at the end. Okay, so let's get started. Macronutrients, you know, these are pretty straightforward: proteins, carbs, and fats. I left the picture up there. Feel free to pause and look at it as you see fit. There are other macronutrients technically, like alcohol, but we really don't consider those most of the time whenever we're talking about the actual macronutrients and what we fit into our actual diets, okay? Meal timing. So higher carbs before and after training may help for recovery and performance. I know there's going to be a lot of variety in how a lot of you approach your dietary practices from a day-to-day basis. Some of you may do intermittent fasting, some of you may do carnivore or vegan or whatever. These are just general recommendations that I've seen work for people who are on standard diets. Okay, so keep that in consideration. Having some carbs before and after training generally helps people feel better during and after training. 3 or 4 meals throughout the day tends to be the sweet spot when it comes to hunger mitigation, but it also helps break the monotony. Unless you're really one of those like hardcore, like 20 off, 4 on intermittent fasting, and you get all your calories in a 4 to 6 hour window, then you do you. But for competition, or excuse me, for people who live relatively like the 9 to 5 normal job, excuse me, that tends to be pretty good. And then the last meal within the 2 hours of sleeping, just to make sure you get some nutrients in before you do hit that fast of sleeping. Which also helps with hunger mitigation, but we'll talk about that a little bit later, I think in a couple slides. Retaining muscle. So we know that adequate protein intake helps mitigate this. Again, we're learning from our fellow bodybuilders or even people who like to bodybuild and do the combat sports, maybe as a hobby. But we know that 1 gram per pound of body weight, or 2.2 grams per kilogram, 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight is more than enough. You can actually do a little bit less than that and help mitigate your protein loss, or muscle loss. But we also know that concurrently lifting weights while you're training and signaling that cell signaling cascade that happens whenever you actually lift weights and challenge yourself appropriately, and that you approach failure at a certain level. We know that it signals muscle growth, and since you're very likely in a hypocaloric state, we still need that, particularly if you're not doing an acute weight loss like water loading or water cutting, like we'll talk about in a minute. So just keep that in mind. Lifting weights is never a bad idea if you're trying to mitigate muscle loss during a weight loss phase. And then hunger mitigation, we kind of brought this up earlier. Eating relatively bland foods reduces your cravings. I have no problem with this. I am Caucasian. I admit it. As Caucasian as I can get, and I am pretty much allergic to seasoning. So I really don't have an issue with this. I'm also pretty psychotic. I may have mentioned in the last video that I have eaten the same breakfast and lunch for like the last 2 years. So don't go based off of me, but this seems to help people stay on track with their diet and not just lose control at night and eat like a tub of ice cream. So it also increasing your vegetable intake. They're very caloric. They're not very calorically dense, but they are satiating. And then they're high in fiber. Well, eating foods that are high in fiber helps mitigate hunger as well. Okay, so now we're to the point of the video where I feel like most of you are going to listen. So water and electrolyte manipulation is, or rather, again, colloquially known as water loading, but in the literature they mainly say acute weight loss or water cutting in parentheses. So what it is you're putting your body in a state of hyperhydration. You're hydrating your body to a level that it's not used to doing, and you're essentially manipulating the hormonal response to your body's hydration level. Hormones like ADH, aldosterone, I think renin is another one, vasopressin, angiotensin, those all kind of play a role in your body regulates those based off of hydration, at least to some degree. And one of the biggest things that I see is people starting water manipulation a little bit too early, or way too early, sometimes up to 2 weeks out. And it's just like, listen, your hormones start to adapt within hours of you doing this. And most of you have actually probably experienced this. I'm willing to bet that if you've gone out to drink with your buddies or your girls, even though like 0.1, there's probably 40 of you who watch this channel. So give me some ideas in the comments where I can get more women to watch the channel. But if you're going out with your friends, you're having a couple of drinks, if any of you have ever quote unquote broken the seal, you have a couple of drinks, you really got to go. And then after you've had one more drink after that, the frequency of urination just kicks up. Once you breaking the seal is actually a byproduct of alcohol inhibiting ADH. ADH is works on the nephron, or the functioning unit of the kidney. I think on the loop of Henle, although I could be wrong on that. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. I think ADH acts on the loop of Henle and helps retain, with the help of sodium, helps retain water with water retention. So let's say that we know that alcohol inhibits ADH. So if ADH stops retaining water, we know we have to urinate. So that happens within the course of a couple of hours. So we know that our hormones respond that quickly. Why would we start water loading a couple, weeks before the actual competition? Just doesn't really make a lot of sense. Whenever we talk about electrolytes, we're mainly talking about sodium. I mean, sodium holds, I think, 20 to 30 times its weight in water. So the electrolyte that we're going to be manipulating mainly, when we say electrolyte manipulation, we talk about sodium mostly. And then we'll talk about a little bit of reconstitution after the weigh-in, if that's possible. Like if you're the IBJJF, it may not be as possible as like the ADCC, who changed their weigh-ins to a 24-hour weigh-in, or the day before, I think in September of last year, which I was a huge fan of. So let's look at the first study that I used to kind of develop this kind of program that I talk people through most of the time. So the first study, they looked at 163 combat sport athletes, 124 men, 39 women. And what they did was the hour leading up to their actual competition, the hour leading up to their weigh-in, it's very important. They measured their urine osmolarity. So they did a test, and they were able to put them into brackets of folks that were euhydrated or hydrated to normal levels, hypohydrated or slightly under the hydration levels, and then there was a category of severe hypohydration. So what they did was, after they measured that, they actually took them through a series of proxies that they used to kind of measure performance. One of them, the bench press, the grip strength, the counter movement jump. They were trying to do some upper body and lower body movements. And then after they weighed in, they were allowed to rehydrate, and then they retook the measurements. And they found that the weight regain and rehydration between the weigh-in and the actual competition actually offset a lot of the muscle function losses. So obviously the euhydrated group had the least amount of change. The hypohydrated group had a little bit more change in the actual muscle loss. So they didn't perform as well on the bench. They didn't perform as well on the counter movement jump or the grip. And then there was another little drop off with the the severely hypohydrated group. However, what was very interesting, I'm going to put this figure up. So this was the relative change in body weight. This is the only one I'm going to really include because the other ones are kind of convoluted. But there was a gigantic, statistically significant change in the hypo and the severe hypohydrated group whenever it comes to the percentage of body change that they had. And when you looked after rehydration, when you looked at the measurements for the bench press, the counter movement jump, and grip strength, the amount of jump relative to their baseline is what you would expect. So the severely hypohydrated group really bounced back a lot relative to their baseline. But what was interesting is if you controlled for that, they actually, the hypo and the severely hypohydrated group were able to get back to really close to their changes in their baseline levels, which I thought was really interesting and kind of went against what I thought my original bias was whenever I started to read this study a couple years ago, or maybe about a year ago. So I thought that was really interesting. You can really, if you reconstitute properly, you can change a lot. You can drop a lot of body weight mass and not suffer your performance, or not drop as much performance as you think you might. So the next study was a little bit more of an intimate study, meaning that the N was smaller. There's only 21 grapplers, but I'm glad it was just grapplers because it's pretty apropos for the group of people who watch this channel. 4 years of experience, at least 8 hours of training a week. They wanted to make sure people were actually training. So the experimental group and the control group. The experimental group did what we consider the traditional water loading, right? So they both started here. So days 1 through 3, the water loading group drank double the recommended amount, and then the control group drank the recommended amount for 3 days. Okay. Then from day 4 to day 1, 2, 3, from day 4 to day 5, they dropped water completely. And I think it's worth noting that everything was the same. So they controlled for electrolyte intake, they controlled for the amount of calories that they weren't able to control everything they ate, but they controlled for the amount of calories, or they call like the energy deficit, and they controlled for the amount of sodium. So the only thing that was manipulated was the water loading in the first 3 days. And they measured something that the first study didn't measure, with hormonal changes. Now, that's really hard to read, so I urge you, and I've cited it at the bottom, I urge you to go read this study and look. But the body mass changes were about what you would believe. The water loading group was actually able to drastically drop their weight and then recover almost the exact same amount that the control group did. And it found that proper water loading techniques is probably safe if effectively monitored for hyponatremia and GI distress and things like that. So I'm just going to throw this figure up here. If you look at the cumulative body mass change, I mean, look at how everything was pretty much the same up until day 4. And then after day 4, or at day 4, when they both dropped water and nothing else, everything was the same, the hormones were doing their job and excreting water given their environment, right? So they try, if you completely take away water and you're hyperhydrated, then it only makes sense that you drop a significant amount more water than if you try to keep water the same. And this is another problem that I see in people. They try to just barely, if you're going to manipulate your water, you need to do it like hard. If you're going to cut, you need to cut hard. It's called acute weight loss for a reason. So you see that big drop, and then look at how much they were able to regain. They were actually able to get pretty close to where it was not even statistically significant, the difference is from a body mass percentage. And then you can see the day-to-day body mass change, not much difference. Day 1 to 2, 3 to 3, or 2 to 3, 3 to 4. Then they drop the water and boom, day 4 to day 5. That's where you really see the magic happen. And then with this body mass change, this was not statistically significant in the study, but it is it is a fair amount. So that difference was a little bit higher. And you will see that if you go and look at this study, there are other figures that show the blood chemistry and the hormonal changes. It's pretty significant pretty similar to these. You see a big drop day 4 to day 5, and then the plots become a little bit closer, denoting that they've actually recovered quite a bit, which I thought was interesting. And I'm glad that they actually measured hormonal changes in blood chemistry, because that's not something that you can control on a very wide with a big population like the N of 163. That would have been a nightmare to try to design. So. And then the last study is the overview of acceptable weight loss practices. This is a review of the literature that looked at I can't remember how many studies right off the head that they included, but they stratified these into safety and the I don't think, do I have the figure here? No, I don't have the figure. But they were able to kind of delineate which ones were safer based off of the practices and the outcomes of the different studies. And it turns out it's pretty intuitive, but it still, needs to be done to make sure that we can validate our intuitions about these things. Gut content manipulation, like laxatives and things like that, seems to have the most downsides, right? I mean, you're messing with gut absorption, and you see that in the form of electrolyte imbalances, and then decreased cardiovascular energy or exercise capacity, which is also pretty intuitive. Second is active sweating methods, follow closely behind, just meaning that it's probably the second least effective way, not effective way when it comes to losing weight, but the safest way. So you see a decreased anaerobic performance because you are using muscle glycogen to actually assist you in losing weight. And then it requires aggressive carb recovery plan again because you're using those carbs for energy in the form of in the form of anaerobic glycolysis whenever you're exercising most of the time. You can do like a steady state cardio, but you're still using muscle glycogen. Okay. Now, and then you have water manipulation like we just talked about. It seems relatively safe if you do it properly, especially if it's mild to moderate, and you significantly decrease your drawbacks there. And it should mainly be fluid restrictions like that one study we saw where all they did was change the water and they still got statistically significant changes in body mass percentage lost, and then they were able to recover really quickly. But I do think that electrolyte manipulation plays a pretty important role, which we'll talk about here in the water loading example. We're just going to use the same guy that we looked at in the second video for his hypocaloric weight loss phase leading up to his competition. Starting weight 192 or 87.5 kilos, and he wants to make 182.6. I think this ends up being about a 6 to 7%, 6.5% body mass change or body weight change. I think it's a little bit more than 6%, a little bit less than 7. But either way, that's within the safe ranges. If you go back and look at the study that we just with the overview, if anything over 7 tends to be what they consider a little bit more dangerous, but this falls well within that. So then, you got the body fat 20, because we want to make sure that you've got the body, or we've got extra tissue if we end up losing any more than that. So, all right, 5 to 4 days out. The recommended amounts are typically 1 ounce of water per half a pound of body weight, or half an ounce per pound of body weight. And then we are going to double those average recommendations at least. Okay, so we got 2 ounces per kilogram of body weight, which ends up being about the same as 1 ounce per pound of body weight. So if we're going to drink 196.2 ounces, that's about a gallon and a half. So I would actually recommend going a little bit more than that. The more acute, the more weight loss you want, the more you would drink to a certain extent. Right? I'm not telling you to drink 3.5 gallons of water. If you weigh 196, but 1.5 to 2 gallons, you could stick on the 2 gallons or 7.5 liters. You could probably go even a little bit higher than that. But then you keep your diet the same. You could even do day 5, 4, and 3 if you want. I've given you a little bit of room here. Manipulate the variables to your specific situation. Then 3 to 2 days out, you're going to have the same water consumption, but you're going to drop the electrolytes for 24 hours. And you stay eucaloric or slightly hypocaloric, meaning that you stay at the amount of calories that it takes for you to just kind of maintain on a daily basis, making sure to reintroduce some calories if you train that day, etc. Or slightly hypo if it makes you feel a little bit better, you're going to lose a little bit more weight. But no salt, that's the big thing there. Then what we're going to do 36 to 24 days out is drop your water completely. Okay, and the next bullet point is different based off of if it's like a 24-hour. Some of these may be different. These are all for I should have mentioned this before, is for a 24-hour weight cut. So you've got the night before to kind of sleep and rehydrate. So you got no water for 36 to 24 hours leading up to the actual weigh-in. Okay, so you weigh in and you've got a solid weigh-in. Now we have to talk about recomping. So getting dry carbs like rice cakes, crackers, granola. This is especially true, and let's say you even have a weigh-in the day of, but it's in the morning. So it's in the morning and you've got to compete like 8 hours later, 4 hours later, whatever. Let's say your water cut has gone so well that you're actually at like, I don't know, what we want, 83 kilograms, right? Yeah, so let's say you're at like 82 kilograms. You've got a kilo that you can gain overnight and still be good to go for the weigh-in. You can actually eat these like rice cakes and crackers and granola and things like that because they don't have any water. You're going to increase a little bit of glycogen weight, okay? So then whenever you weigh in the next day, you're going to sleep better, right? So that thirst response doesn't keep you from sleeping as much. Or excuse me, your lack of water and nutrition doesn't wreck your sleep the night before. You actually sleep a little bit better if you're able to get some of those dry carbs in, so you get a little bit of glycogen. Then you weigh in the next day, make weight, and then as soon as you start drinking water and introducing the electrolytes back into your system, it sticks, and you absolutely, like, you will be able to notice a difference between like in 4 hours about like looking dry and depleted versus like filled out. So make sure also on the day of comp, a lot of people just go and they feel like they could eat anything. If you want to reduce the amount of gastric distress that you have, I would keep the fats lower. They're just slower to digest, and it takes a lot. I mean, if you're like me after a high-fat meal, I want to go to sleep immediately. So carbs and lean protein are things that I would eat the day of the competition, and even as snacks in between different bouts. If you're in a competition, or if you're in a fight, you've only got one fight, so that you could just make sure that you reconstitute properly up to that fight. I know that there are a lot of variables involved, and that's why it's very hard to give you a structure, but take the literature, take the structure of the example that I gave you and manipulate it to, and if you have any questions, please ask, which, you can ask questions on my Instagram or my Gmail or the